sure yours as well. Climate justice is a matter that concerns us all, and certainly concerns all the people that are here in this room. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And Aric is more than qualified to lead us in that because he's given it a lot of thought for a long time. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to all of the organizers for making this happen and for inviting me. And you know, every time I come to this building, I'm struck by the very beautiful art of nature and the seasons. It's so gorgeous. So as Mary mentioned, my name is Aric. I'm the Climate Justice Lead at the Providence Center for Justice, Peace, and Integrity of Creation. I'm also an organic farmer and an author, so I recently finished my 8th book about social movements. So I write about both how social movements make change, how people make change in society, and I also write some novels, mostly climate fiction, looking at kind of different futures. And so today we're going to be talking, be talking about reading our conversations about climate change and climate justice. And our workshop today is going to be kind of strewn through the session in 3 different parts. So first of all, we're going to discuss how to talk amicably and powerfully about climate change with neighbors, family, and friends. For each of these sections, I'm going to give kind of an introduction. I'll talk a little bit, and then we're going to have small group discussion that we will report back on. Part 2 is about how to counter disinformation. And so specifically, we're going to look at a particular example about natural gas plants or fossil gas plants. And we're going to do a little bit of a role play at the end. So I hope a couple of people will be up for kind of demonstrating some of these techniques or approaches in a conversation. And then the last part of the workshop is about how to work together and help each other. And so that is really about some of the approaches that we can use to be more effective, to build good alliances, to attract people to want to participate in this kind of work. And it's more structured around the kind of things that you want to do after leaving today, what you want to go back and be doing in the community. And so I will also talk in that very last section, I'll talk a little bit more about my farm and some of the things that I do in this vein. And so today, feel free to kind of jump in or interrupt with questions. That's totally fine. My job here is to be, useful and helpful to you as much as possible. So, feel free to jump in if you have thoughts or questions. To start with today, I'm going to give you 17 tips for good conversations. And at each of your tables, there is a little handout that has on one side, a list of the discussion questions for each of our 3 parts today. And then on the other side, it has a list of all of these tips. So that's available to you. You can kind of write down extra notes if you want. And so I'm going to focus on climate change today, but I actually think that these tips are useful for any kind of difficult conversation that you have to have. It's been observed that we live in an increasingly polarized society where people feel like they have more trouble talking to one another. And so these are tips that I think we can use in many different situations. The other thing I want to mention is that this is not a checklist. So the intent is not you should be using all 17 of these in every single conversation. These are just different tips or tools, only a few of which are might come to mind in any given conversation. So I want to start with a question for you, which is, have you ever had a tough conversation with someone about climate change? Or have you ever had a difficult conversation with someone about environmental issues? And yes, can you tell me a little bit about what happened?
Well, I had lots of conversations with people online in various web forums and in person.
Yeah.
And try to articulate, my view. I'm not always sure, but exactly what my view is, I guess that's a good starting point.
Yeah.
But you see a lot of things out there. You see people who believe that the effects of climate change in a really serious way won't be realized for centuries.
Yeah.
And therefore, something to worry about. And all the way to people who think that we're doomed within 3 or 4 years as a species. So there's these two extremes, and I've encountered people on all points within that.
Thank you. Yeah, those are both challenging, right? Because both of those extremes basically say we don't need to do anything or we shouldn't do anything.
Or we can't do anything.
Or we can't do anything.
Or there's no action to take that will fix the situation.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Other difficult conversations? Yes, please.
I have one friend who is extremely right-wing, and she's telling me that, well, of course, that this is nonsense, that we're actually heading into an ice age, that this is all cyclical, that sort of thing. I've had others say, don't worry about it, God will fix it. Things like that. I even had a former friend who was an officer with the Ministry of Natural Resources who simply said to me, I don't worry about it, what will be.
Right, yeah. Thank you. Any other examples that are jumping out? It could be about climate or it could be about the environment in general. Please.
I have friends and neighbors in Florida when I lived there. And I always recycle. I recycle as long as I can remember. And very few of my neighbors put out recycling, which was disappointing. And a couple were very good friends. And I kind of commented on it one day because, oh, you know, it's just a waste of putting all these extra trucks on the road to pick up recycling. They're just putting air that way, so what's the difference? Okay, that was rather challenging to respond to without having a problem.
Fair, yeah. Virginia.
Well, I know a family of very bright engineers in the States, and the patriarch of that family just believed that any problem that we face could be fixed by technology.
Yeah. Any other examples? Don?
Well, I was out on a kind of a hike, we were walking down the Cataraqui River, and it was a beautiful place to walk, except that it was all gone. It had been washed out in the last storm that we had. And so one of us happened to say something about the result of climate change. There was an elderly, not elderly, because I'm elderly. He said, you don't believe all that stuff CBC is telling us to do. And I started to tell him, well, I read my first story about climate change when I was 17. That's a while ago. So then he didn't engage in the conversation. He got mad and his wife put her head down and walked away.
Yeah, that's tricky. And it can be very hard to talk about climate in general because, you know, climate is entangled with everything, right? It's entangled with every aspect of our economy. It's entangled with politics and political parties. And so it's both, it can be very challenging to talk about, but it's also really important to talk about because it does tie into everything, because it shapes so much of what our collective future looks like. So today, I'm really going to focus on how we can have conversations with neighbors, friends, and family. So people we have like ongoing relationships with. And if we were doing a training about like how to talk to the media, how to give an interview about climate change, I would probably give you fairly different advice and different suggestions than we're going to do today. Because that's a different kind of context, right? So if you're talking to the media, then maybe there are like specific facts or anecdotes or stories that you're just trying to get across. I don't know if has anyone had any kind of media training here before? Maybe a little bit. So, you know, one of the things that you're often advised to do in media training is that if you're giving an interview and someone asks a question, an interviewer asks a question that you don't like or you don't care about, just answer with whatever you want to say, right? Answer with your soundbite. And that's fine on, if you're giving an interview to the Week Standard and you just want to get the right soundbite in the newspaper. But if your neighbor asks, so how's your day going? And you reply, well, it's going fine, but with carbon dioxide now exceeding 400 parts per million, blah, 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 like that may be factually true, but it's not going to build the relationship, right? And so much of the advice that I'm going to offer today, or the tips, are really about how to have these conversations while building relationships over time. Because with climate change or with any tough issue, people don't actually transform their opinions in one conversation. They don't transform them overnight. And this is the really counterintuitive thing. They don't transform them primarily on the basis of facts. And this is really hard. It makes this a particularly hard issue, but there's been a lot of research that shows that if someone doesn't believe in climate change at all, if you give them 10, peer-reviewed, highly expert, evidence-based facts about why they should believe in climate change, their disbelief in climate change will actually increase. So facts alone can actually make people really dig in their heels. In the media, again, it's really important to have credible facts to fact check things. But in one-on-one conversations, that alone doesn't do the job. There are actually a bunch of other things that have to do with relationship building and authenticity that we're going to talk about today. And we'll get into some examples. Any questions before we look at our 17 tips? Okay, feel free to jump in at any point. So the first thing that I want to encourage you to do in these conversations is to understand your goal in that conversation. So do you want someone to come to an event with you? Do you want your neighbor to or your family member to come to something like this? Or to come to a film screening? Is your goal that you want them to take some specific action, whether that's recycling or even voting for some kind of resolution? Do you want them to see a new perspective because they're only they think the CBC is full of lies and they're only reading kind of right-wing media? Do you want them to abandon some myths or some misconceptions? Do you want them to collaborate with you or work together on a project? These all suggest different kinds of conversations, right? Maybe your goal is actually just to open up the topic so that they feel like you can talk about it and you can come around to it again next time. So for me, it's important to understand your goal while also strengthening that personal connection, right? Building that personal relationship that can allow you to have tougher conversations. What's really important, I think, in conversations in general about tough issues is to emphasize the common ground and build credibility. So it's really critical to find what common ground you have and express that. So, because things are so polarized, it's easy to have an us versus them approach. And people, when they feel like, they might slot you into, this is a tree hugger or something. And then it's easy to dismiss that person. People have categories, this person is woke or this person is whatever. And then they stop listening. And so one of the things that's really important to do is identify that common ground, whatever it is with that person. So in terms of recycling, if that person doesn't recycle or they don't care about recycling, is there a deeper value that you do have in common that you can build on? So maybe they don't like recycling, but they also don't want to have a bunch of, pop bottles and cans scattered on the side of the road. Maybe they don't like littering. Maybe they care about aesthetics, something like that. Or maybe you have different opinions about fossil fuel burning plants, but you both have people in your family with asthma, and so you both care about air quality or clean water, all these things. I think it's really important to emphasize that common ground. Are people familiar with the idea of calling in versus calling out? Have you heard this before? Okay, so calling out, this happens in the media a lot, and it's, if someone does something that's bad, maybe they get canceled, then people will call them out. So they'll say, oh, this person did something that's really harmful, they're like a bad person, we shouldn't listen to them anymore. And that, there are people who maybe we shouldn't listen to anymore, but in personal conversations, that's a way to stop the conversation, right? So if you call someone out and you say, oh, I think what you just said is like really ignorant. Well, you've basically ended the conversation, right? And potentially the relationship. And so one of the important things to do in finding this common ground is what's called calling in. So instead of saying, oh, you've done something bad, you actually want to invite them to have a conversation with you about that topic. And we're going to get into some tools. We have some tools to do that as well. An important part of this, too, is building credibility. And so, people who don't believe in climate change at all, for example, they might not care that someone on the news is talking about climate change. They might not care that a professor is talking about climate change. But they might listen if their neighbor is talking about climate change, or if their neighbors are doing something to respond to the climate emergency and to take action, right? So that could be, if you are growing a garden, if you put a heat pump in your house, if you've taken other steps to change your life, these are ways to build credibility. Understanding facts. So if someone doesn't believe in climate change, being able to say, 99% of climate scientists agree that climate change is caused by humans, primarily by burning fossil fuels. Like, that's great to know, but there are other ways to build credibility as well in the context of our neighbors. So finding a shared purpose is something that's really important as well, building on what we talked about before, or a nearest common value. So, maybe you really think that we should get rid of private cars and just have buses everywhere, right? We should just have public transit. And maybe your neighbor thinks that public transit shouldn't be funded at all and we should just drive around in Hummers all the time. So what is a shared common value that you can find with your neighbor who maybe believes that? It might be tough, but to investigate that, to think about it, to try to find those common values is important. So maybe you care about the safety of kids playing in your neighborhood. Maybe you both think that kids should be able to play in your neighborhood without being worried about getting hit by a car or something like that. Those are really key things to understand. Because if you want to meet your goal in that conversation, the easiest thing to do is to turn that into a shared goal, to identify something that you agree with your kind of conversation partner about. And so is your common value something like, well, we all care about our children, or we care about future generations? Is it that we all care about clean air and clean water? Is it that we want public money to go to communities instead of corporations? Is it that we want to have more livable neighborhoods or more livable cities? I often think about this cartoon, this political cartoon from 2009 that you may have seen. So it's a list on the right of these things that at a climate summit that could be offered, that you could get by climate action, right? So if we do these things to prevent climate change, then we can have, preserve our rainforests, create green jobs, have livable cities, clean air and water, healthy children, etc. And then someone in the audience is saying, what if it's all a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? And so, the idea is that, sure, we may disagree on some specifics, but ultimately we're looking at deeper values about making a better world. And how can we find those and how can we express those? Another really important tip when you're talking to people about tough subjects is to ask questions. To ask genuine questions that make space for conversation. So, I think that it's easy when we see someone who, say, doesn't believe in climate change at all, which is this huge threat to every person on the planet, it's easy to get really frustrated and stuck in trying to correct someone, right? So if they say something, then you say, well, no, that's not true, da, da, da. You might say something else, and you're like, no, that's wrong. But these kinds of conversations, if you want to persuade people, then it's not actually about correcting other people. It's not a debate per se, right? It's about having a genuine conversation. And part of that is to ask questions. So you can ask, like, are you worried about how climate change will affect the next generation? You can also ask about the impacts of climate change that they see. So often what will happen is, I'll have a conversation with someone and they'll be like, yeah, I can't believe the weather lately. Have you seen all these, all the immigration crises? There's people, refugees all over the world. The cost of living is getting so high. And then I'll be like, yeah, climate change is really affecting every part of our lives. It's causing mass migration. It's making things more expensive. It's making our weather more dangerous. They'd be like, climate change? What are you talking about? Because a lot of people don't see that abstract kind of high level stuff. They don't perceive that as being connected to the crises that they face on a daily basis. And so a really important approach, I think, when you're asking questions or talking to people is to ask about those impacts. So ask about the things that their daily life is being affected by and help make that connection. And if you don't know what to say, you can always ask something like, what makes you feel that way, or why is that important to you? And then when you ask a question, it's important to listen deeply and genuinely. Have you ever had a conversation where you feel like the other person's just waiting their turn to speak? Does that make you want to talk more to that person? No, not really. And I also know some people who are really great, who care a lot about climate, who care about environmental issues a lot, and know a lot. They know a lot of facts. But then when they have a conversation with someone, they kind of dump facts, they kind of monologue. And that doesn't produce the kind of dynamic that will lead people to actually listen, engage in conversation, want to talk, and ultimately to change their opinion. People are more likely to listen when they feel like they're being listened to, right? So don't just wait your turn to speak, but genuinely listen, because that will strengthen your connection. And it's also important because it will clarify the other person's beliefs, right? It's really helpful to understand not just what someone believes, but why they believe that. What is maybe a barrier to more shared understanding? Are there misconceptions? This sort of thing. It's really important to understand. Another piece of advice I have for you is to go off script. So I think in a lot of conversations that I've had about climate or environment, sometimes I end up talking to people and what they respond with is the last thing that Doug Ford said at a press conference, or the last thing that Pierre Poilievre said. And it's easy for me to respond also with maybe some kind of political cliche. And then we get into this loop where we're just having conversations that other people have had in the media. It's not really a conversation between us. So I think it is important to go off script, to say things that are not political cliches or what everyone's already talking about, so that we can have a more genuine conversation. Another piece of advice I have that's helped me a lot is to adjust my vocabulary. I think this is one of the most important things, to adjust my vocabulary to fit the people or person that I'm talking to. And sometimes that's about highlighting urgency, right? So generally speaking, I like to use the phrase climate emergency rather than climate change. There's nothing wrong with climate change, the climate is changing, but that has a sense of neutrality to it, right? It's very vague, and it doesn't always suggest what we want to suggest, right? So climate change could mean that we're heading into the next ice age, that it's going to get colder, which obviously is not what's happening. So for me, I am careful to use phrases like climate emergency, because that suggests the need for action, right? That highlights that it's something that we need to do something about. And that's also about, in terms of how we talk about people and current events. So if we're talking, I would never use terms like illegal immigrants or illegals to talk about human beings. I might use words like climate migrants or climate refugees, both because that kind of language is more humanizing, right? Calling someone an illegal is a fundamentally dehumanizing way to talk about a person. but also because it incorporates the cause of the issue, right? That around the world, there's more than 120 million people right now who are actively displaced by climate, and that number is continuing to grow. So using words like climate refugees, it's a little bit more humanizing, and it points to the source of the problem. On the other side, there are also a lot of words that I find useful in certain conversations that are actually not very useful sometimes if I'm talking to my neighbors or friends or other people. Maybe kind of abstract jargon or phrases that mean something specific, but that might not be understood by your audience, right? So colonialism or decarbonization, for example, these are words that have really specific meanings, but most people don't know those meanings. Neoliberalism, another great example. So my advice is to try to think about what you want to say in a way that uses plain speech and as little jargon as possible, right? So if I'm talking about decarbonizing the economy, I'm probably not going to say that to someone who's not already kind of thinking about energy policy or energy issues. I'm going to say, well, we need to build a more resilient energy grid that's based on renewables. Or we need to have local energy generation that can survive extreme weather, that sort of thing. Or if I'm talking about colonialism, unless I'm talking to indigenous friends or people who work on these issues, I'm going to say, well, the issue is that our government stole indigenous people's lands and banned them from using their own languages, and these other issues that are practically what happened, and that are in plain speech what I'm actually concerned about. Be honest and start from the heart. Again, this can be counterintuitive because we're used to kind of trying to argue facts with facts. But the research shows if we want to convince our neighbors, they're more likely to be convinced by a sense of connection and by kind of the prevailing opinions that are shown around them. So for me, I am part of the fire and rescue department on our island. And so I used to be a paramedic. I respond to medical calls on our island, emergency medical calls on a weekly basis. So one of the things that I might say to start from the heart is I might say, I respond to a lot of calls from people whose medical conditions are exacerbated by extreme heat or by poor air quality, especially when we have forest fires. And for me, one of the reasons I'm concerned about climate change is because it directly affects the health and well-being of my neighbors. And I want my neighbors to be healthy and safe. So that's a key approach for me. So this is a way also of building common ground, right? To share your own personal experiences and your perspectives in a way that has emotional content, not just kind of fact-based content. We're going to talk about this too in our discussion period, but it's important to share how climate change has affected you and also how you've taken action on climate change. Because this can open up new kind of avenues of conversation, and it will also build your credibility. So balancing facts with values. It's not that facts aren't important. Facts are really important, but we need both to persuade people. And that's about combining personal examples, like the ones that I just gave, with authoritative sources. So using that combination of research and shared values. Because if people understand that you have shared values, if they feel like you're on the same team, that actually makes them listen to you more, right? Whatever facts you share, whatever opinion you share, that comes across as more relevant to them. They'll take that in a more strong way. Contrasting is another really important tool that I've found in these conversations. So contrasting is when you say what you want and what you don't want. Because often in tough conversations, it's easy to talk past one another, right? It's easy to respond to what we assume the other person wants, and they might assume that we want different things because that's what they heard on right-wing radio or something like that. So I often find it's really helpful to be explicit about what I want and what I don't want. So I might say, if I'm opposed to this, new oil pipeline, I don't want to eliminate jobs. I want to create safe green jobs. Or, if I'm opposed to a new fossil gas plant, that's not because I want an unreliable electrical grid. I actually want to build a network of renewable energy generation that's cheaper and more reliable. We can also use testing, so we can actually ask, people's opinion. Do you want Z? And just to be clear, that's not something like, so do you want everyone to boil to death? Because obviously that's not really a genuine question, and that's not going to increase your connection. It's more like, do you think it's important to protect vulnerable people, or for us to do things that will protect people from the worst effects of climate change? This, I think, is pretty clear. Treat your conversation partner with respect as a human being. If we give people respect, they're more likely to give us respect in return. Try to probe for deeper reasons behind a disagreement. So the reason that people say they disagree with you, sometimes it's because of facts, but often it's because of values, or because they feel like they're part of a different team than you. Do your best to avoid or relieve defensive behavior. And this is, again, kind of tricky, but I'm sure you've all seen this, that if people feel really like their identity is being challenged, if they feel like they're fundamentally being challenged as a person, they can get really defensive, right? They can get their back up, and then they stop listening. So, if you're concerned about, say, climate refugees, and someone else says something like, "Oh, we should ban all immigrants from Canada until there's enough housing for everyone," or something like that. You might say, "Oh, well, that seems like a really cruel response to people who are climate migrants." And maybe it is, but that's really going to shut down the conversation, right? Because you've challenged this person personally. So it's ideal to find a way to find that common ground, that common element, and what you have, the beliefs that you have in common and that you share. Because if you can create kind of a safety through demonstrating that shared purpose, then you're more able to have ongoing conversations over time. On a similar note to model good behavior, so if someone gets upset or kind of rude, just demonstrate how you would like to be treated in the way that you have a conversation. Speak to them in the way that you want to be spoken to. And then, as we come into the end stretch here, one of the tips that I have is to understand when the person you're talking to is not actually your audience. And by that I mean, sometimes in group conversations, if someone says something that's really homophobic, I'm probably going to challenge them. And that's not necessarily because I think that I'm going to change that person's opinion. That might not be my goal, that might not be my audience. What I'm actually doing in challenging homophobia is trying to make other people, maybe gay people who are in that crowd, feel like I will support them, right? Feel like someone else cares and will support them and will challenge that kind of behavior. And sometimes that's important for bystanders. And then you can have a better relationship maybe with that person. Second last, you can always learn something from a conversation. And I always, I've been an organizer for a long time, and after every conversation I take a moment to kind of reflect and think, okay, what did I learn from that interaction? Did I learn, if I tell this particular story, maybe it resonates really well, or if I tell this fact, it doesn't matter. Sometimes what I learn is this person's not going to listen to me, and it's better next time to just talk about not the weather, because that's about climate change, but it's better to talk about sports or something, and I don't want to waste my effort, or I don't want to waste my energy. And that also goes to the very last kind of tip that I have for you, which is that it's okay to withdraw a conversation from a conversation. It's not about winning, it's not about making sure that you convince someone that your opinion is correct or that they're wrong. it's with friends and family and neighbors. It's really about building some connections so that you have opportunities for more conversation in the future, or to recognize that you just don't have enough in common with them to really dig in, and that you want to talk to other people. You want to focus your effort on other relationships or other conversations. So those are my kind of 17 tips or tools. Do people have any questions before we get into the kind of discussion period? Okay, so I have some discussion questions for you. So you have about 25 minutes to talk in small groups. I'm hoping that you'll talk about these different questions. And that we'll have a time at about 11:15, so in about 25 minutes. We'll have time to share some of the things that we talked about, some of the things that we brought up. So these are also on your sheet there. But what I'm hoping you'll talk about is, what are some of your goals for conversations with other people? What are some of the underlying values that make you want to respond to the climate emergency? So why do you care about climate change in essence? How does climate change affect you and yours? What actions have you taken because of the climate emergency? And then lastly, just if you have time, what kinds of disinformation or misinformation have you encountered? Because that will segue into the second part, to our next conversation. Does that sound good? Okay, great. So please converse amongst your tables. I will kind of move around and check in with each group as you go. Okay, thank you.